If you come to this video and part of your training in intercultural competence and communication, you have probably already dealt intensively with the following topics. You have looked at definitions of the concept of culture and cultural models, and you have understood that our perception does not produce a one-to-one copy of the world in our brains, but instead is an extremely complex and error-prone process. The attribution theory helped you to pinpoint the source of misunderstandings, and you learned to slow down and clarify your perception through the DIE process formula. By examining stereotypes, you began to question your own thought patterns, and in the unit of identity, you were able to gain insight into the cultural and individual parts of our human nature. With the typology of ethnocentrism, you have learned to control your deeply rooted basic attitudes, and the module on otherness and strangeness, you have developed tools with which you can independently examine irritations and experiences of otherness or strangeness to prepare the ground for learning interculturally. As a teacher of German as a foreign language or business English, when I walk into a classroom and announce that we are studying grammar today, I usually receive a very unenthusiastic response or little to no enthusiasm. However that is, I can assure you that the so-called cultural grammar is much more interesting. The name and idea of cultural grammar come from the anthropologist Edward T. Hall. His theory is that learning culture is analogous to learning a language. Children naturally learn the language and culture through the process of enculturation, a process that occurs unconsciously and automatically. If it is now possible to learn a foreign language in addition to your own mother tongue, it should be also possible to learn a culture, and because language learning in the 1950s, at the time Edward T. Hall lived, was largely about learning grammar. He dubbed the concept culture grammar. So Edward T. Hall began to search for the basic ideas behind culture. For this it is called cultural grammar. This cultural value orientation, as cultural grammar is also called, can be seen as an orientation of people's actions towards certain values and basic assumptions. Cultural grammar is intended as a theoretical approach to help us understand and anticipate cultural differences and commonalities, of course. To do this, we work with taxonomies similar to those that exist in different scientific fields. Here you can see an example where the dimension of styles of communication forms one category of the taxonomy on culture. We will get to know cultural dimensions as well as cultural standards. Average tendencies in cultures are presented as an index on cultural dimensions. Let's take the example of communication styles. On the far left, we find a very expressive communication style. Example, a style that involves a lot of body language, perhaps even touching the other person while speaking. This expressive style could be described as very lively. At the other extreme, we find the very reserved communication style, in which sparing body language, no touching, and generally rather restrained communication patterns are common. If we now take an average of all examined Egyptians, all Germans and all Japanese, we might arrive at these respective indices described on this dimension. An example, the indice for reservedness for Japanese communication patterns. Of course, individuals do not always conform to averages. Some Germans may speak much more expressively than the average Egyptian. And perhaps there are also Egyptians who have a much more reserved speaking style than the average Japanese. Let me give you an overview of the cultural dimensions of Edward T. Hall, Gerd Hofstede and Fons Trompenaars. Gerd Hofstede conducted the most extensive empirical research on culture to date in over 130 countries. Fons Trompenaars, the son of a French mother and a Dutch father, which doesn't make him Belgium, he says, was a student of Hofstede. Built on his research and he worked as a manager and as a management consultant. The cultural dimensions highlighted in green are relevant to our course. Low and high context depict how much information is implicitly embedded in a situation, how much information needs to be expressed explicitly in words. The attitude towards time goes beyond the prominent aspect of punctuality to include elements such as simultaneity or short or long-term orientation. The cultural dimension of space refers to interpersonal space as well as to privacy and publicity of certain topics and information, as well as rules in the respective rooms. Individualism and collectivism describe the orientation in societies towards the individual or the group and the resulting consequences for communication and for the behavior of people in these cultures. The dimension of power distance describes the emotional and power relations between boss and employee, between teacher and student, but also between parents and children. Another dimension, that of activity, deals with our tendency to enjoy the moment or to actively work towards a better point in time in the future. The other dimensions are available here for interested course participants. However, the taxonomies of Hall, Hofstede and Trompenaars do not cover all dimensions that have been developed in the field of intercultural research. Finally, perhaps I should mention the dimension of shame versus guilt culture, which was established by Ruth Benedict, but which is, I'd say, highly controversial, of course. Cultural dimensions are not pigeonholes or fixed categories. Cultural dimensions, they allow us to show tendencies on a scale between extreme values. The different cultural dimensions refer to basic dimensions of human behavior and offer us an opportunity to decode a foreign culture, but also to reflect on our own culture. The so-called cultural standards provide another possibility. Before I begin, I would like to mention the criticism on the concept of cultural standards. Some of my colleagues would say that cultural standards are essentially better stereotypes. Cultural standards are determined for national cultures. For Germany, for example, there are 7 cultural standards that define which types of perceiving, thinking, evaluating and feeling are considered normal and binding for a majority of Germans. If you're interested in German cultural standards, you may want to watch the English video on cultural standards of Germany, which can be found on YouTube or linked below this video. Of course, cultural standards have a tolerance range. However, we perceive the behavior of others. We evaluate this behavior, often unconsciously, based on cultural standards. These cultural standards represent what is seen as normal in a respective cultural sphere. These affect not just our picture of others, we also control our own behavior through cultural standards. We could call cultural standards a kind of cornerstone of the cultural ordering system. The existence of such cultural standards, like cultural influence as a whole, usually only becomes apparent in the event of a critical intercultural interaction. When applying cultural grammar, cultural dimensions and cultural standards, we should consider the following. We only ever discuss the tendencies of a society. These tendencies are not suitable for predicting or assessing the behavior of individuals. The behavior of individuals often deviates from cultural standards rather than conforming to them. Viewing in a taxonomy uses cultural dimensions with extreme values that are easily and very often misunderstood as two separate categories, which is perhaps a consequence of our tendency towards dualistic thinking. Cultural dimensions are not about fixed, contradictory characteristics. On the contrary, cultures are usually both individualistic and collectivistic. It's just that one dimension is more common and more prevalent. Especially when working with cultural standards, there is a risk of stereotyping in the sense of all Americans are individualists or Mexicans are always unpunctual. Cultural grammar should always be applied in a critical manner and should be supplemented with the previously mentioned skills of precise perception, self-distancing and self-reflection, as well as empathy and changing perspectives, all of which we have already worked to develop throughout this course. However, the advantages of cultural grammar outweigh the disadvantages because it also allows us to reflect on our own culture, build a cognitive map of cultural differences, and compare between and across cultures. On YouTube, I encourage you to leave your remarks in the comment section and to like and to subscribe. And I look forward to your valued cooperation and feedback on the seminar on the online learning platforms.